In today's lecture, we would be talking about issues of power and identity with special reference to the queens in ancient Indian history. And for this, I would be specifically taking up the period of the Vakatakas, who were the contemporaries of the Guptas. Basically in today's lecture, I would be giving a detailed reference to an article by Shatarupa Bhattacharya. The name of the article is Probing the Absence of Maharani, a survey of the Vakataka inscriptions. And this was published in Indian Historical Review. The most important theme that would be discussed at length would be the theme of gender identity, power, kinship and kingship, with specific reference to the important role that was ascribed to women, but again there were a number of limits within which that role could be played. The article looks at the issue of power and attempts to understand gender identity through the study of inscriptions. The aim is to trace features of kingship and look for the queen's place in the entire power structure through the study of inscriptions. So, as you know, there are a number of sources for history. And these sources can be divided into different categories. So, in today's lecture, the most important source that we would be talking about would be the inscriptions, and as we would be going into a detailed study of epigraphy of this period and how with a renewed interest and insight by various scholars who want to rewrite history from a gender lens, some interesting observations can be highlighted. Now, coming to the issue of gender identity. Gender identity can be seen in terms of representation of women and men in a variety of domains. So, these domains could be economic, social, political, religious and cultural, and it is in this context basically that ways in which women and men are represented or they represent themselves acquires great significance. So, therefore, one cannot really think that whatever has been mentioned in the inscriptions is the fact per se. A historian's job or a sociologist's job is to read in between the lines, so that one can decipher the hidden meanings as well. In order to study regional social formations, understanding gender relations becomes pertinent. Gender identity can be seen in historical terms, as ways in which identities of men and women were constructed in a particular region during a particular time period. The article looks at the question and also at the position of the queen in the context of kingship. So, therefore, while a lot of emphasis is usually laid on royalty or is usually laid on the genesis of kingship or the basic genealogy related to kingship, the queens are generally neglected. So, in this lecture we would be talking about certain queens who were able to influence the way inscriptions were being written or they were being designed, and they also had their ways in a number of other ways. So, the most important theme that one comes across in most of the inscriptions that have been studied so far is the issue of household that is generally associated with the life of royal women. So, women's identity was sought to be fixed and understood in terms of her gendered being, so it was defined essentially by her sexuality, by her relationship, by her reproductive value, and studies of women have generally been restricted to the family as a wife, as a mother or a daughter, and they are overall, one can say that they are confined to the household paradigm. So, her contribution to society was generally relegated to the background, and her role was seen only as far as the procreative functions were concerned. So, women were perceived as a passive social category, from a monolithic category. Women, or specifically elite women, were grouped into a different kind of framework, and this has largely been studied by scholars like Kirit K. Shah in the work concerning royal women. So, K. Shah in path-breaking work on royal women has tried to justify the very reason that why most of these historical sources should be reinterpreted with a gender lens. The emphasis was on the donative capability of women in different geographical areas, which focused on their control over resources. So, the very fact that women were donating to institutions like temples or monasteries, or even to individuals and also to Brahmins, it shows that they had control over resources and they were free to make a decision regarding the disposal of those sources. How far were royal women capable of claiming a position which was similar to that of the king is an interesting question that can be asked in contemporary times. The construction of gender identity through the formalized structure of kingship is something that would be attempted, and it has been attempted very well in the article that I am going to speak about. So, the article takes into account both the implicit as well as the explicit aspects of gender identity, and there is an attempt to explain what kingship meant for Vakatakas, and also look at the identity that was claimed by the regent queen Prabhavati Gupta. So, there is a detailed reference to the important role that was assumed by the Vakataka queen, who was a regent queen also, named Prabhavati Gupta. The question that remains pertinent is, how far can queens claim power and to what extent they succeeded? So, even if the situation demanded that a queen was ruling in name of her minor son, was she really able to wield power on her own terms and in her own name? Then also it is important to understand the relationship between kingship and kinship. A question that is relevant for the present study is how rulers in early India claimed power. And also, can we talk about a queen with equivalent power? Was there a situation in which the queens also in ancient India were able to exercise, that kind of hegemonic power or not? In historical terms, the king claimed power by identifying himself or herself as the legitimate ruler. So, legitimacy was a very important reality that had to be proved time and again, and a ruler's access to power has legitimacy, and one way to claim it was through kinship ties, that is through relationships and also through imaginary relationships to ancestors who probably were more imaginary rather than they would have existed in reality. Now, coming to the issue of Prabhavati Gupta, there had been a few women rulers in Indian history. It is not as if she was the only one or the earliest one to have ruled as a regent queen. There have been studies to show, especially in early India, that loose political structures had the possibility of women rulers, for example, in Kashmir and in Deccan. The article this article which I am going to refer to, there is a detailed reference to the Vakataka queen Prabhavati Gupta, who ruled as a regent. Now, a question that arises here is that how does she claim her position as a ruler? It is equally interesting to understand as to how she identifies herself, what markers she uses, and also it would be fruitful if we compare those markers with other kings of the dynasty. A comparison will give us an idea about the gendered notion of kingship, and how when a female became the ruler, just like Prabhavati Gupta, the whole discourse changed, and the way orders were conveyed, or the way inscriptions were being inscribed also underwent a change. A very detailed and a very interesting and path-working work has also been done by Cynthia Talbot on this theme. According to Cynthia, women who had access to political power and how far were they capable of claiming a position similar to that of the king. This is the theme that Cynthia has analyzed in great detail. Cynthia Talbot points out that women rulers in Andhra again were part of a loose political structure, and kinship ties seems to have played a very important role in terms of women's access to political power. She also points out that a regent was a preferred system than a fully independent woman ruler. And therefore, it was a rarity that the women became rulers on their own, or they were ruling in their own names. Now, the whole concept of the regent queen became quite mature, and it kind of was also put into practice in the case of the Vakatakas, as Prabhavati Gupta seems to be an example of how the lack of a direct male heir was made it imperative that she assume the role of a regent for her son, as her husband had died. This is the perfect case study also of how one can understand the interrelationship and the larger complexities between politics and women. In politics, a woman's role was limited to being the wife of the reigning king and the mother of the successful ruler. Textual sources do not refer much to women in the political sphere, suggesting that her role was more or less marginalized, and women as rulers were hardly discussed. And there are very few sources which even talk about women independently, or even royal women are not really referred to repeatedly in many of the inscriptions. And as has been just pointed, even if the reference to women names has been there, it's more as a symbolic gesture to highlight that so and so woman was the mother or the wife of such and such king. So, therefore, when one comes to the issue of sources and women, the place of women in the royal household has been a matter of discussion in many sources. Her place in the royal household might not be as marginalized as the texts portray. So, the texts or various other sources which are silent about women, they need to be re-looked at, and one needs to read, probably explore more, and they have to be the sources have to be revisited, so that the gender lens helps us in exploring facts that have been hidden, and the queen's position in the household might have been dictated through the kinship relations, and this was precisely what happened in the case of the Vakataka queen Prabhavati Gupta. Now, inscriptional sources are very important sources of understanding ancient and early medieval Indian history. They implicitly or explicitly mentioned women. It is not as if women are not mentioned in these inscriptions. The reference was not only as the wife of the donor, but sometimes as the donor herself. And this is again a very interesting fact, because for large part of history it has been considered that women have not been talked about or that they have not been recorded. But then there are so many records, there are so many records pertaining to donations of land and wealth which do mention women donors. The role of women in political history has not received much attention in secondary works. However, her role was limited to that of the wife of the king, mother of the successor, and rarely as the daughter of the king. So, while the sons of the king have been repeatedly mentioned and their names also come up in various inscriptions, the daughters of the king however remain untalked about. According to Cynthia Talbot, the case of Rudrama Devi, who was the queen of the Kakatiya dynasty, is discussed at length. The fluidity in society which made it possible for a woman to exercise power through the adoption of masculine titles, attire and attributes has been discussed at length by taking up the case of Rudrama Devi. So, Cynthia emphasizes the direct role that was played by women in politics of the region and also tries to provide a structural and contextual explanation for the same. There was evidence for the emergence of the women who had power, especially in the Deccan and Kashmir. So, while there are so many examples that exist for these regions and so many regional studies have already talked about such power politics and how gender was kind of being revisited as a result of these regional changes and regional processes of state formation. A very important role that was coming on its own was the issue of cross kin marriages. It was possible that the women in these regions like in Deccan or in Kashmir were successful in claiming power because of cross kin marriages, which led to the integration and consolidation of ruling lineages. So, their marriages within and amongst their own relatives probably strengthened the concept of the royal family, and it also helped in the integration which ultimately helped in emergence of regional structures of power. Devika Rangachari has also provided a regional survey of gender relations in Kashmir, Kannauj, and also in Bengal and Bihar region. And this analysis also dwells at length as to how kinship helps in strengthening kingship. So, it is very important to understand the importance of lineages, family history, much of it which was of course fabricated, and it had largely been attempted in order to bring about greater legitimization for the royal authority. Devika Rangachari uses textual as well as inscriptional sources to corroborate her research, and Rangachari's work emphasizes on the agency of women in social and political processes, without which history of early medieval North India would be distorted. So, it is high time that we do not take into consideration the distorted history that has been studied so far, and this can only be done by revisiting the sources and by trying to extract newer information which brings to the fore the important role that was being played by women in these various regions. Epigraphy has definitely great use in polity. By epigraphy we mean a study of inscriptions and coins, and epigraphical records are seen as a cultural practice of early medieval period. The most notable feature of the age of inscriptions was the impulse to document religious gifts in a permanent form. So, the gifts that were received on stone that were being given to the Brahmins or the temples or the monasteries. They were recorded on stones as well as on copper plates in order to ensure their permanency and longevity, so that the coming generations would also have a chance to look at them, and this would also kind of enhance the power and authority as well as legitimacy of the person who had given these grants. So, therefore, one needs to understand the kind of politics, the hidden politics that was working behind so many inscriptions coming up from time to time, especially from the early medieval period onwards. The majority of the inscriptions were about religious endowments, and according to Talbot, Talbot has kind of correlated inscriptions with political changes, and also points out that in the case of Andhra, the period of political stability saw an efflorescence of inscriptions. So, as the royal dynasties were able to exercise their power over a particular region for a much larger period of time, so with the onset of stability, there was also an upswing in the number of inscriptions. This could be seen in the eloquent titles as well as epithets that were used to describe the king and the greatness of the dynasty. So, therefore, inscriptions had a very important political role, and they kind of legitimized a particular royal household. However, it is not that inscriptions as a source of studying history are without problems. So, there are some problems also of epigraphy. Epigraphy records are significant, but there are a number of problems regarding their accuracy. And another problem with this source is that many records are fragmentary or they are damaged. So, some important information might be missing. So, there could be a case of misinterpretation or wrong information being processed as part of history. So, therefore, some important details are not always very forthcoming. Then also most of the inscriptions, since they have been recorded at the behest of the royal power or the donative agency, so therefore, they portray only part of the picture, and some very important details which could have given a critical perspective are deliberately avoided. Then inscriptions again are of many types, and these different types of inscriptions have to be handled with care and with lot of objectivity. So, subjectivity cannot really be used while working on these various inscriptions. So, broadly speaking, inscriptions could be divided into panegyric and donative. So, those inscriptions that were more in the form of eulogy and praising the donor have to be considered with great caution, and they have to be included also as part of history writing project with many ifs and buts. According to K.K. Shah, the inscriptions that were in the regional states that were emerging during the early medieval period, they are an ideal source material to study about the about the initial struggles and also the power politics that was playing in these regions, and in terms of nature and purpose were either a donation or they were a dedication to a particular sect. Now, the most important inscriptions are generally a mixture of both the types, that is panegyric as well as donative, and usually inscriptions begin with a panegyric describing the king or the donor and the dynasty, followed in details of the grant along with the rights and exemptions that were conferred on the donee. So, donee was the one to whom a grant was made, and the donor was the one who had given the grants, and the donee was had a right to enjoy those grants in perpetuity. So, the genealogy of the Doni was incorporated after all the details etc. about the donor had been given, and along with the genealogy of the Doni, there was also a tendency to talk about the achievements of the Doni and the reason why he had been selected and why he had been given a particular grant. Then the next important step was the names of the officials or the social groups to whom the grant is addressed, and also the scribe and the executor. So, basically all those who were responsible for giving a shape and form to an inscription and also for putting an inscription into words, they had also to be mentioned. And finally, the date and the occasion of the grant accompanied with the seal of the king, and this could be generally noticed in most of the inscriptions. While this was the general system, not all the grants followed, however, this uniform pattern, and there was no uniformity per se, but most of the royal inscriptions followed this kind of a pattern. Now, since our lecture would be specifically focusing on Vakatakas, so therefore, it is important to talk about Vakatakas with reference to the time and space before we proceed further. Vakatakas succeeded in the last quarter of the 3rd century CE in central India after the Satavahanas, and they have also been considered as the contemporaries of Guptas, because Guptas were also flourishing roughly during the same time frame. So, from a minor ruling dynasty, they became a major power by the 4th century CE. So, this period of approximately 100 years from 3rd to 4th century CE was instrumental in enhancing the power of the Vakatakas, and a lot can be ascribed to the importance of tracing a genealogy as well as the system of land grants that had become very important by this time, and Vakatakas definitely championed a number of grants. The Vakatakas claimed to be the Brahmanas of the Vishnu Vriddhi Gotra, and their first king was Vindhya Shakti. Most of their inscriptions are found in northern Maharashtra, while their rule extended over other parts of Maharashtra as well, but most of the inscriptions are there in northern Maharashtra. For the present study, 34 inscriptions of the Vakatakas have been studied by as has been mentioned in the article, and 14 of these inscriptions, 2 of these inscriptions are fragmentary in condition, and the Vakatakas had 2 branches, one which ruled from Nandivardhan and another was Pravarapura, which is mentioned as the eastern branch. The other branch that ruled from Vatsagulma was treated as the western branch as well, and of the total 26 inscriptions belong to the eastern branch and 8 to the Vatsagulma branch, which is the western branch of the Vakatakas. In the western branch, there were no grants which mentioned donations by women. So, the donations by women are usually mentioned in by the eastern branch of the Vakatakas. 16 grants were given by kings of the eastern branch, and other men besides king, there were other men also who granted land regularly, and these included ministers or feudatories of the Vakatakas, and 3 grants belonged to the eastern branch and 4 to the Vatsagulma or the western branch of Vakatakas. Of the grant by the queens, there were 3 grants by Prabhavati Gupta and 1 by an unnamed queen of Pravarasena II. Now, the grants by other women were by the daughter of Prabhavati Gupta. The 2 joint donations from the eastern branch mention grants by the king as well as the minister. So, these are some of the details pertaining to the various grants that have been discussed in the article. Now, what we are more concerned about is that how many of these inscriptions can be considered as implicit markers of identity. That is, gender identity is kind of implied, and it's kind of implicit in the way these inscriptions were framed. So, for this one has to consider dating methods, language and the script. These are considered as the implicit markers of identity in an inscription. And every region has its own characteristic method of dating as well as the specific language and script that was to be used. And if we talk about Prabhavati Gupta's inscriptions, in terms of scripts, the Puna plates of Prabhavati Gupta contained an admixture of northern and southern alphabets. The northern variety predominated, which was seen as an effect of the Gupta relationship, because Prabhavati Gupta was after all a daughter of the royal Gupta household. But there are some scholars who do not really consider the script that was used by Prabhavati Gupta in her inscriptions as being representative of Gupta influence. For example, A.M. Shastri says, as Prabhavati Gupta's other grants such as the Riddhapur and Miregaon inscriptions were in the box headed variety. Therefore, he argues that the choice of the script depended solely on the scribes. So, since this box headed script was widely in use in the in other parts of Deccan and in Maharashtra, so therefore, it is considered more as an influence of regional pattern that was being followed, or the kind of style that was adopted by a particular scribe who had designed this inscription. The ruling patron was only interested, according to A.M. Shastri, in getting his or her grants and other details properly recorded. While this could have been the case, it is interesting that it was only in the grant by a queen of North Indian origin that the use of the northern script was noticed, because in none of the other Vakataka inscriptions, this northern style of script, which was largely an influence of the script that was used during the Gupta period, was noticed. So, it might indicate that Prabhavati Gupta wanted to create a separate identity for herself, and she thought that her own identity as being a Gupta princess was far more important and valid to give her legitimacy as a queen could not be done away with. So, apart from Prabhavati Gupta, no other grants by women show variations in terms of the script. So, here one can draw a conclusion that probably Prabhavati Gupta was an independent minded queen who wanted to take important decisions regarding her land grants, regarding the way she wanted to be recorded in history, and also the style of the script that she preferred. And she made it a point to implement what all differences she had decided to continue with, or whatever unique characters she thought she carried as part of her legacy. The Vakatakas used Sanskrit as the language and the box headed variety of northern alphabets as script in their inscriptions. For the eastern branch, all the records were in Sanskrit. Now, in the matter of language and script, again as we are discussing the importance of implicit identities. So, both language and script, if we consider these, the Vakataka inscriptions show a transition from Prakrit to Sanskrit, which showed that Sanskrit was, in fact, Sanskrit had acquired a higher status and was also the means of claiming legitimacy, and also it was considered as a means for attaining Sanskritization and getting identified with the higher culture. So there was a jump from literal tradition to upper tradition, a higher tradition. There was uniformity in the use of language and script in the records of men as well as women, except in the case of the Pune grant of Prabhavati Gupta. So, the very fact that both men and women were using the same method of dating, language and the script in the records showed that probably they shared a common administrative culture, and this was definitely a very interesting fact that was highlighted, because till now it was considered that women were deprived of using Sanskrit, and if one talks about most of the plays that were written by Kalidasa, the women and the lower marginalized castes are generally depicted as speaking Prakrit, whereas rest of men folk are conversing in Sanskrit in most of the plays. They used similar official method to record their grants. In this respect, even the feudatories and the ministers followed the trend of the ruling class. So, the use of Sanskrit by both the royalty as well as by the the next hierarchy was common for men as well as women. This uniformity shows a deviation from the Sanskrit plays, where women were shown using only Prakrit, which was a non-elitist language. Therefore, the use of Sanskrit in records of donations by women implied their access to the elite language, and this again was limited only for royal women. Now, having discussed the implicit markers of identity, let us now talk about the explicit markers of identity, which points out the status that was claimed by the king or the queen, and they form an important basis to understand the position of the ruling elite. The titles that were used by the kings or by the queens, the kinship relations that were emphasized by them, then the grants that were given, and the officers that were addressed to in these inscriptions, besides the seal if used, are the explicit markers of identity. So, the very fact that all the important officers were addressed to in the grants that were made by the royalty, and the same practice was not used in the grants that were made by the women like Prabhavati Gupta, speaks volumes about how gender identity was explicitly being conveyed through these practices. Now, coming to the titles, that is using the epithets and which the ruling king or the queen and other officers and the feudatories claim, the grander the title, more high sounding the title, more was the power that was ascribed to the person. A queen from a strong and powerful lineage was generally mentioned with high sounding titles, and the range of titles that were used by the Vakatakas. For example, Pravarasena I was described as Samrat in nearly all the inscriptions. Then another ruler, Rudrasen I, claimed to be a Rajan in his own record, while the other records used the title Maharaj for him. Then the western branch or the Vatsagulma branch of Vakataka records a different title for Vindhya Shakti I, Sarvasena I and Pravarasena I, that is Dharma Maharaja. This was the title that was used by this branch, and this branch also claimed the title of Samrat for Pravarasen I and Maharaj for others. Now, let us compare these titles with the queen's titles. For the Vakatakas, queens did not share titles with the king, but used different titles such as Mahadevi or Agrama Hisi. Prabhavati Gupta, who ruled as a regent for her minor son, did not use titles equivalent to those of a king, while she was very much in her capacity a ruler, even though a regent queen. The title used by the unnamed queen of Pravarasena II was Mahadevi. Again, this was falling short of the kind of importance and value that was ascribed to the other titles that were associated with male members of the royalty. Then there is also an issue of derivative titles, that is, women used only derivative titles, which would imply that the queen derived power from the king, or the kind of relationship the queen had either with the king as a wife or with the king as a mother was what was important to be mentioned. The range of titles used was limited as compared to that of the kings. Nevertheless, she claimed a similar status by claiming such high sounding titles, and the next important marker of explicit identity, one can talk about genealogical records. And a lot of information has been gathered by scholars. For example, Nandini Sinha Kapoor, in her article on state formation, shows how the Vakataka king Pravarasena II legitimized political status and authority using genealogies. Now, what were these genealogies? The genealogies were like family histories that went back to several generations. So, they were also a figment of imagination, where probably some connection, some remote connection would be made either to the solar or to the lunar families. And so, the Suryavanshi or the Chandravanshi kind of connections were generally talked about. Then scholars agree to the role that was played by genealogy in the process of legitimization, but these were perceptible to changes over time and also over region. Also, very useful information has been provided by Professor B.P. Sahu, who points out that from the Gupta period onwards, various strategies were used to strengthen control and this kind of included construction of genealogies as well as appropriation of Itihas Puran. That is, the whole idea that a particular royal family was really historical and there was a whole generation of history behind that particular family, and it was not as if it had come out of nowhere or it had no family legacy to call of its own, was very important why these genealogies became instruments of political importance also. So, both the traditions as well as patronage of art and literature, and also the land grants to Brahmins, then to various tirthas, to temples, monasteries, etc. They all began to be related to the construction and recording of genealogies time and again, in order to highlight the important role that a particular ruler was performing by championing the cause of these religious heads. So, the inflated genealogies were seen as a marker of status as well as power. So, therefore, one cannot really neglect the important role played by these genealogies. For the Vakataka, especially eastern branch, the jumbo plates of Pravarasena II, which have been dated to 422 CE, this was the first to record the genealogy of the dynasty. So, for the first time an attempt was made to record this dynasty's genealogy in this, and the same genealogy was recorded in the rest of the inscriptions of this branch. So, the same pattern was followed in rest of the inscriptions also. Now, coming to the issue of a queen's relevance. The mention of queens, if at all, in the various genealogies was in the sense of one through whom the successor was born. So, that was the only reason for a particular queen to be mentioned, though they were not mentioned repeatedly, but even if they were mentioned, it was primarily due to their procreative functions. The general term that was used in the context of women was utpanna, that is produced from. So, the name of the ruler and then utpanna from such and such queen. Thus, the identity of woman was not always sharply delineated in dynastic records, and again this speaks volumes about the kind of gender discrimination that was prevalent, and the way it got manifested in historical traditions also was part of the same story. Now, coming to our discussion on the gender perspective. From the gender perspective, Prabhavati Gupta's records deserve a detailed analysis, not just for the fact that they were recorded by the queen, but also that they recorded genealogy of the Guptas and not the Vakatakas. Again, this is a very interesting information. Rightfully, she was a married queen, so it was expected that she would be giving a detailed genealogy of her husband. But here we have the case where it is the genealogy of her parental family of the Guptas that was mentioned with great details and fanfare, and there was no mention of the genealogy of the Vakatakas. So, therefore, if we now do a comparison between the genealogy of the Vakatakas as is mentioned in the Jambu plates of Pravarasena II and the Pune plates of Prabhavati Gupta, some interesting facts emerge. One important difference one can highlight in both these cases is that Pravarasena II did not mention his wife or wives in his records. So, the genealogical record of Pravarasena II does not really take into account the names of the wives. There was a reference of a grant by Pravarasena II's wife in his Masoda plates, without a mention of her name and lineage. So, the very fact that no place was given to Maharanis or to Ranis in the inscriptions speaks volumes about the kind of gender inequality that was prevalent even among royalty. And in fact, whenever a queen was even referred to as vaguely, she was referred to as Bharya Mahadevi in the inscription. Thus, only a few selected mentioning of the queen's very existence was attempted. Now, carrying forward our discussion on the differences between the Vakataka and Prabhavati Gupta's inscriptions, Prabhavati Gupta's grants were to Vaishnava shrines, whereas the Vakatakas were followers of Shiva. So, here again we see that she had a mind of her own, she had a religion of her own, and she made an independent choice as to whom she wanted to patronize or whom she wanted to promote. She also specified her Gotra as Dharana, whereas the Gotra of the Vakatakas was Vishnu Vriddhi. So, here again her insistence on carrying forward with her premarital legacy and identity gives some interesting insight into the mind of Prabhavati Gupta. So, Prabhavati Gupta retained her paternal Gotra as well as her paternal lineage, something that was mentioned in her inscriptions, and this is definitely an interesting fact that has been highlighted by the scholars. So, if we take into account Prabhavati Gupta's Puna plates and Ridhabur plates, her mother Kuber Naga of Naga dynasty also did not give up her paternal family name in marriage. So, again mentioning the matrilineal descent of the king appears to have continued by the Guptas. Now, the Puna plate inscription refers to the Gupta lineage rather than to the Vakatakas, as I have just mentioned. She used the superior title of Maharaj Dhiraj for Chandragupta II as well as Samudragupta, while she ascribed the title of Maharaj for Rudrasen II. So, here again she is making a she is kind of treating both the dynasties differently. So, while Rudrasen II, who was a Vakataka ruler, was addressed to as merely a Maharaj, but her own father and grandfather, they were addressed as Maharaj Dhiraj. So, here again we see how she wanted to portray her origin and how she wanted to project her superiority. A comparison shows that Prabhavati Gupta used eloquent titles only for her father. She mentioned several Ashwamedhas that were performed by Chandragupta II, which was otherwise assigned to Samudragupta in the Gupta inscriptions. So, here again we see that she was kind of experimenting or playing with the facts that were there, and because she wanted to project her own greatness, being the daughter of a great ruler who had performed several Ashwamedha sacrifices, so even if they were performed by Samudragupta, they could be ascribed to her own father. And definitely they were not ascribed to any of the Vakataka rulers. Having shared with you all these differences, I shall now take a break, and in the next lecture also we would be talking in detail about how Prabhavati Gupta's inscriptions give us an insight into the world of gender identity and also gender politics. Thanks a lot.